Like a person keeps jewels in a locked safe, Savannah has always kept its secrets safe. Every cobblestone corner of the city is full of history. Old mansions with windows that look like tired eyes watch people walk by. There was a house among these buildings that saw whole generations come and go. It wasn't beautiful, but it was very quiet, which drew attention. The Bennett home was on a street with trees in the historic district. The magnolias, which were hundreds of years old, cast dancing shadows on the red brick walls. The Bennett family moved to Georgia in the late 1940s. They brought with them a lot of money they had made from textile businesses that no one really questioned. Thomas Bennett, the head of the family, was a tall, thin man who always wore dark suits that seemed to soak up the light around him. His wife, Margaret, stood with an elegant but distant posture, as if she were always lost in thoughts that no one else could understand. They moved into that 3-story Victorian mansion with its grand facade and gardens that would soon be left to fall apart on purpose. At first, the neighbors could tell that something was different about that family. It wasn't rude, but it also wasn't welcoming. Even on the hottest days of the summer in Georgia, the curtains stayed closed. There wasn't much movement outside the windows, and when Thomas or Margaret left for appointments in town, they did so quickly and with purpose, like someone who had to do something unpleasant before going back to the safety of their thick walls. People who paid close attention became morbidly curious about the basement of the Bennett house. The door to the storage room was on the side of the house and was protected by a strong wooden door with locks that seemed too much for a simple room. In the early years, delivery men who had to bring down supplies from time to time said that there was an unusual chill coming from that area, even when it was really hot in the south. There was also a strange smell that some people said was a mix of wet dirt, rusty metal, and something that felt like medicine in the throat. In the winter of 1952, Thomas Bennett hired workers from outside the area to install a complicated ventilation system in the basement. The workers did the job without talking and left without asking questions. The project included ducts that ran through the walls and connected to small openings that let air flow freely. To the few who knew about the change, it seemed like a strange investment in a space that was supposed to be used only for storage. But Thomas had his reasons, and those reasons stayed hidden, along with whatever was living in that basement. Margaret started to act more and more alone. She spent hours in the library at home reading old medical and anatomy books that she ordered from specialty bookstores in faraway cities. When she handled the books, her hands always seemed to shake a little, and dark circles under her eyes got worse, like ink stains spreading on porous paper. She didn't smile very often, and when she did, the smile didn't reach her whole face. It stayed on her lips like a mask that didn't fit well. The family's daily life was very structured. Every morning at 7, Thomas got in his black sedan and drove to work in the business district. Margaret stayed at home and moved through the mansion in ghostly silence. She always had a silver key on a chain around her neck. That key opened the door to the basement, and she went down there often, staying for anywhere from a few minutes to a few hours. When she got back, the strange smell that had gotten into her clothes stayed with her, and her eyes showed that she was more than just tired. The workers at the Bennett house didn't stay long. The family hired servants through agencies, always making it clear that they needed people who were quiet and didn't draw attention to themselves. Still, people were always leaving. Some people just didn't show up after the first week. They left their things behind and left the town without saying why. Others finished their contracts but wouldn't sign new ones, even though they were offered very high salaries. When asked, they would look away and mumble about how heavy the air and sounds were coming from places where they shouldn't be. Ruth was the longest-serving housekeeper, staying for almost 8 months. She was a middle-aged widow who really needed the job. Ruth quickly learned that she should never question her bosses, keep her eyes down, and keep her questions to herself. But even her need had its limits. It was a hot June afternoon when she heard something coming from the basement while she was cleaning the hallway on the ground floor. It wasn't a scream, but it was a sound that showed more deep sadness than any words could. That night, Ruth quit and wouldn't even take her week's pay. Savannah's autumn came in softly, with a breeze that blew dry leaves across the sidewalks and brought a welcome break from the heat. At this time of year, the Bennett mansion felt even more cut off from the rest of the world, as if a sadness had settled over it. The trees around the property lost their leaves, leaving a golden carpet that no one bothered to sweep. This gave the place an air of planned abandonment that kept people from getting too close. During that time, Thomas Bennett started to travel more often. He was gone for days, sometimes weeks, and when he came back, his suitcases were always heavy, and his face was even more closed than usual. During these trips, Margaret stayed alone in the house, and the neighbors noticed that the basement light stayed on for several nights in a row. A faint, yellowish light came through the small windows at ground level, hinting at constant activity in that underground space that few people had ever seen. The mail that came to the Bennett house was strange, and a lot of it. Packages of all sizes came every day. Some had stamps from other cities in Georgia, while others came from as far away as Massachusetts and Illinois. The mailman who worked that route for years had gotten into the habit of not ringing the doorbell and just leaving everything on the porch. He would then hurry back to his car with barely hidden haste. He never said anything about how heavy some packages were or how they sometimes made a muffled noise, like something fragile had broken while they were being shipped. The local shopkeepers were interested in Margaret's shopping routine. Every Monday, she went to the pharmacy in the middle of town and always bought strange amounts of gauze, rubbing alcohol, and other supplies that made it seem like she was always taking care of wounds. The pharmacist, an older man who knew all the customers by name, tried a few times to start casual conversations about how to use those things. But Margaret only said polite one-syllable words before leaving quickly. She also went to a certain butcher shop a lot, where she bought cuts that seemed too big for just two people. She always paid in cash and didn't want her purchases to be wrapped very carefully. The basement's physical structure was more complicated than anyone outside could have guessed. Thomas put a lot of money into fixing up that area in the first few months after buying the property. Adding more layers of brick to the walls made them stronger and insulated them, which kept the temperature steady all year round and muffled sounds. The original dirt floor was covered with thick concrete, and a drainage system was put in place with almost surgical precision. There were metal shelves that went from the floor to the ceiling, and Thomas and Margaret were the only ones who knew how they were set up. In the winter of 1953, a plumber was called in to fix a problem with dampness that was threatening the house's foundations. Thomas watched the man work for 3 days straight, never leaving him alone in a room. Thomas went down to the basement first when the job required it. He stayed there for almost half an hour before letting the plumber in. Even so, the work area was clearly marked off, and heavy curtains blocked the view of most of the room. The plumber finished the job in a professional way, but later told his coworkers that something in the basement made his skin crawl in ways he couldn't explain. People noticed that Margaret's body was getting worse. She tried to hide the calluses and small scars on her hands with gloves, even when it was hot outside. Her walk got heavier, like she was carrying an invisible load that got heavier every day. She stopped accepting invitations to social events altogether, saying that she was always getting migraines and was in bad health that needed rest. The truth was that Margaret could barely keep up with small talk without her mind drifting back to what was waiting for her in the basement of her house. Thomas kept a diary in a drawer of his desk, where it was safe from prying eyes thanks to a small but strong lock. The pages of that leather-bound notebook had detailed notes written in his sharp and clear handwriting. He wrote down dates, times, measurements and observations that only he could understand. There were sketches in the margins and technical drawings of structures and mechanisms whose purpose was not clear. Margaret had her own copy of these records, which she kept in a wooden box under the couple's bed, where no one else could see them. As the months went by, it became clearer that the couple was having problems. You could hear quiet arguments through the thick walls. The muffled words showed how important and angry they were. Thomas told Margaret that she was emotionally weak and let her feelings get in the way of what he called practical needs. Margaret replied with bitter acceptance, reminding him that there were limits to what they had agreed to do. But they both knew they were stuck in a situation that didn't let them go back. It was like swimmers who had drifted so far from shore that they needed the same impossible energy to go back as they did to move forward. The noises coming from the basement changed with the seasons and cycles that only the Bennetts knew about. There were times when the basement was almost completely quiet, making it seem like an empty, forgotten space. Then came the times of activity, which were marked by loud noises, heavy movements, and that smell that got stronger until it came through the cracks in the locked door. People who lived nearby learned to ignore these changes, telling themselves that they were just the strange habits of a strange family and didn't need to be looked into further. In the spring of 1954, there was a small but noticeable change in the air around the Bennett house. The flowers in the nearby gardens were in full bloom, but the grounds of the property were in bad shape, with only weeds growing in the empty flower beds. Margaret started going out even less. She became almost like a ghost that could be seen through the curtains, watching the street with a sad look on her face that was almost like regret. During this time, Thomas took more steps to protect himself. He put new locks on all the outside doors of the house and built an iron gate at the side entrance that led to the basement. The blacksmith who was hired for the job told his wife that the bars were strange because the spaces between them were too small to be just for decoration, and the points curved inward, as if they were meant to keep people from getting in but not getting out. She told him not to tell anyone else, and he agreed without saying anything. There were things about Margaret's health that stress or age alone couldn't explain. She got a cough that wouldn't go away, and it echoed through the empty halls of the mansion. Each time it happened, it sounded like it was scratching her throat. She no longer tried to hide the gray strands that had appeared in her once shiny brown hair. The dresses she wore were too big for her now that she had lost weight. They hung on her like clothes that someone else had borrowed. Thomas noticed these changes with a worry that he didn't often say out loud, but that showed in the way he looked at his wife during quiet dinners. The basement had turned into a lot more than just a place to store things or work on personal projects. It was now the center of the Bennetts' lives, the point around which everything they did revolved. At least 4 times a day, Margaret went downstairs with trays of food that always came back empty, even though she was eating less and less. Thomas checked the locks and ventilation systems way too often to make sure everything was working as it should. They had made a schedule that kept them busy enough that they didn't have to think too much about what they were doing. One night in April, a violent storm hit Savannah. The winds bent old trees, and the rain hit the roofs like angry drums. Later, the neighbors who lived closest to the Bennett property said they heard noises that made them lock their own doors even more carefully. They weren't exactly screams, but they were something that made you feel bad. The walls muffled them, but they could still be heard through the storm. When the sun came up in the morning, everything seemed normal again, as if the night before had been just a bad dream for everyone. Thomas started to drink more than he usually did. He kept a bottle of whiskey in his office, and every week the amount of the amber liquid that was left was less. Alcohol didn't make him talk more. It made him think more, and he fell into even deeper silences that Margaret didn't try to pull him out of. She had turned to sleeping pills that she got with prescriptions from a doctor in another city. These white pills helped her sleep for a few hours when she couldn't handle the guilt and exhaustion anymore. During this time, the Bennett family was completely cut off from other people. They canceled their subscription to the local newspaper, cut ties with the few acquaintances who still tried to stay in touch, and began shopping at increasingly distant establishments where no one knew them well enough to ask questions. The mansion became an island of secrets in a city that breathed community and tradition, a place where the walls were not only physical but emotional, erected brick by brick through choices that could no longer be undone. Margaret developed the habit of talking to herself while working in the basement. Her soft voice murmured words that Thomas couldn't make out when he was upstairs, but the tone carried a soothing quality, as if she were trying to comfort someone, or perhaps herself. She spent hours organizing and rearranging the supplies on the metal shelves, searching for some kind of order in the chaos they had created. There were times when she would simply sit on the steps of the stairs, looking at the space before her with eyes that seemed to see through walls and time. The records the couple kept became more detailed and, at the same time, more cryptic. Thomas noted numbers corresponding to measurements only he understood, while Margaret drew diagrams showing progressions and regressions, according to criteria known only to her. They didn't often show each other these notes, and each person kept their own version of the truth that was hidden beneath the surface. It was as if documenting everything was a way to maintain control over a situation that clearly controlled them more than they cared to admit. Spring gave way to summer, and with the increasing heat came the intensification of routine. The ventilation system worked constantly, its hum becoming part of the house's permanent background noise. Margaret increased the frequency of her visits to the pharmacy, and Thomas began to travel less, as if his presence were now essential to maintaining some kind of precarious balance. They existed in a bubble of suspended time, where days blended into one another, and the only marker of the passage of time was the gradual change in their own faces, increasingly tired, increasingly haunted by the weight of what they kept in the depths of their home. Summer enveloped Savannah like a damp, suffocating blanket, bringing with it afternoons where the air seemed too thick to breathe comfortably. The Bennett mansion, with its perpetually closed windows, became a silent oven where the heat accumulated in layers. Margaret moved through the corridors like an exhausted shadow, her cotton dress clinging to her back with sweat that never quite dried. Thomas spent hours in his office, the electric fan humming uselessly as he shuffled papers and maps spread across the mahogany desk. The nights offered little relief from the oppressive temperature. Margaret often woke in the early hours of the morning, the sheet beneath her soaked, and her breathing rapid, as if she had run a long distance. She would then go down to the kitchen, drink water straight from the tap, and remain there in the darkness, trying to calm her heart, which pounded against her ribs like a caged bird. Thomas rarely slept more than 3 or 4 hours at a stretch, and she could hear him pacing upstairs, his heavy steps revealing a restlessness they both shared but never openly discussed. The basement demanded constant attention during that period. The summer humidity threatened to compromise some of the systems Thomas had installed, and he went down several times a day to check levels and adjust mechanisms. Margaret accompanied him on these inspections, carrying additional flashlights that cast distorted shadows on the brick walls. They worked in a synchronicity developed through months of practice, communicating through minimal gestures and economical words. There was a cold efficiency in their movements, as if they had become cogs in a larger machine that gradually consumed them. Thomas began to consider changes to the physical structure of the space. He sketched out possible expansions, calculating the costs and risks of hiring new workers who would ask inconvenient questions. Margaret watched these plans with an expression difficult to decipher, something between resignation and silent horror. She didn't object verbally, but her silence carried its own weight, a passive form of resistance that Thomas chose to ignore. He was convinced they needed more space, more resources, more control over the situation they had created. The mail continued to arrive with predictable regularity. Packages of varying sizes piled up on the covered porch, some remaining there for days before Thomas brought them inside. There was a certain standardization to the deliveries now, as if he had established reliable suppliers in various cities. Margaret didn't ask about the contents of these packages, and Thomas offered no explanations. They had developed a language of silences that worked better than words could, a tacit understanding of the boundaries that shouldn't be crossed in their conversations. Margaret found unexpected refuge in the books she kept accumulating in the library. She read volumes on botany and chemistry, anatomy and philosophy, perhaps seeking some kind of intellectual justification for what they did in the depths of her house. The pages offered a temporary escape, a world of abstract ideas that contrasted cruelly with the concrete reality that awaited her in the basement. She underlined passages randomly, making notes in the margins that rarely made sense when reviewed days later. It was as if her mind was fragmenting, unable to maintain coherent thoughts for extended periods. Thomas maintained appearances when he needed to go out on business in the city. He shaved carefully, wore his dark suits, and assumed a mask of normalcy that deceived even superficial acquaintances. In the offices he kept in the business district, he discussed contracts and investments with a firm voice and direct gaze. Only someone observing very closely would notice the occasional tremor in his hands, or the way his eyes occasionally lost focus, wandering to some distant and disturbing place. He always returned home in a hurry, as if every minute away represented a risk he couldn't fully calculate. The couple developed rituals that structured their days. Breakfast at 7 o'clock, always in silence. First descent into the hold at 8:30. Frugal lunch at noon, consumed quickly and without pleasure. Afternoon checks, equipment adjustments, system maintenance. Dinner at 6 o'clock, usually consisting of leftovers or simple meals that Margaret prepared without enthusiasm. They spent the night keeping records and making plans, each in their own space, until they were too tired to stay in their own bed, where they stayed as far apart as continents separated by oceans. The tension between need and repulsion dominated every aspect of their lives. Thomas constantly argued for practicality, for the cold logic of the decisions they made. Margaret nodded in agreement, but her eyes told a different story, revealing a soul divided between what she intellectually accepted and what she viscerally felt. They were trapped in a dynamic where retreating meant confronting everything they had done, while moving forward required burying ever deeper any vestige of conscience they still possessed. In July, summer reached its peak, and the heat made the asphalt soft and made dogs look for shade all the time. The Bennett mansion seemed to pulse with its own internal heat, a fever that came not from the weather, but from something deeper and more morbid. Margaret lost more weight, and her bones stuck out under her pale skin. Thomas had chronic insomnia that no medicine could help. They were always tired, going through the days like sleepwalkers stuck in a nightmare they couldn't wake up from. They didn't want to wake up because doing so would mean facing the harsh truth of what they had become. Autumn came back as a welcome relief, bringing cooler breezes that finally made it possible to open some of the mansion's windows. Margaret used these times of fresh air to open the windows in the upper rooms, but the basement door was always locked, keeping its secret safe no matter what time of year it was. The leaves started to fall in their yearly dance, piling up in the neglected garden in layers of gold and red that no one bothered to clean up. The property looked even more deserted, as if nature were trying to take back the land that the Bennetts had cut off from the rest of the world. Thomas made a choice that would change the way his routine worked in small ways. He started writing down everything in even more detail, not just numbers and measurements, but also personal thoughts that showed a mind trying to make sense of choices that couldn't be changed. His diary entries started to get more philosophical, asking questions about what it means to be human, the limits of morality, and the cost of knowledge. He wrote for hours after Margaret had gone to bed. The sound of the pen scratching the paper in a hypnotic way helped him put together his thoughts, which were getting more and more jumbled. Margaret, on the other hand, found a strange kind of peace in the middle of the chaos they were living in. She fully accepted her part in the situation, letting go of the last bits of resistance that were still bothering her. This complete giving up brought a terrible freedom, a lack of conflict that came from crossing an invisible line where regret and remorse lost their meaning. She did her work in the basement with mechanical precision, and she didn't hesitate like she used to when she did things. It was like she had turned into someone else, or maybe she had finally shown who she really was behind all the civilized pretense. The system they had built now worked with almost industrial accuracy. Thomas had made detailed plans that made the most of every part of the needed maintenance. Margaret followed these steps with almost religious devotion, checking off items on carefully arranged lists. They didn't need to talk to each other very often while they were working, because they both knew what the other would do next. It was a creepy dance that took place in the dark corners of their basement, where only the brick walls could see it and stayed completely quiet. Thomas started traveling more often again, but this time for a different reason. He went to libraries in faraway cities to look at old books that weren't available in Savannah. He looked for examples from the past, people who had been through similar things in different times. What he found in these old books brought him both comfort and horror. They showed that he wasn't the only one who had done wrong, and also showed the dark fates that usually awaited people who went down those paths to their inevitable ends. Margaret started having vivid dreams that stayed with her even after she woke up. She dreamed of hallways that went on forever, doors that multiplied without end, and staircases that went down further than any sensible measurement could show. In these dreams, she looked for something she could never find or ran away from, something she could never see clearly. When she woke up, her pillow was wet with tears she didn't remember crying, and her heart was racing more than it should have been because she was so tired. The couple's relationship had changed into something that was hard to put into words. It wasn't love in the usual sense, and it wasn't just for convenience. It was a bond made by secrets they shared and actions that cut them off from the rest of the world. They relied on each other in ways that went beyond the practical, and they were connected by chains that couldn't be seen but couldn't be broken. Thomas needed Margaret to be there to feel like things were normal, and she needed him to confirm the false reality they had created together. The seasons went on as usual, not caring about the dramas that were going on inside that mansion. Winter was coming again, and the days and nights were getting shorter. Margaret started lighting candles in the upper rooms, which made yellowish islands of light that only made the shadows around her stand out more. She spent a lot of time just watching the flames dance, lost in thoughts she didn't share with anyone. Thomas sometimes asked Margaret about these times of quiet thought, but she only smiled vaguely, which didn't help. The basement was no longer just a place for them to be. It was now a mental state, a place they lived in their minds even when their bodies were in other parts of the house. Eventually, any other topic of conversation would lead back to things that had to do with that basement. What they kept down there always affected their plans for the future. They had let that space take over their lives so completely that they couldn't tell who they were apart from what they did in it. Thomas got a nervous habit of checking the keys he carried in a heavy bunch on his belt all the time. He would touch them over and over again to make sure they stayed where they were. Margaret watched this habit with a mix of understanding and worry, seeing signs of decline that were probably similar to her own. They were slowly falling apart, not because of big events, but because of a slow erosion that wore away their mental foundations, just like water eventually dissolves stone. But knowing this process didn't mean they had the will or ability to stop it. And so they kept going down those stairs every day, going deeper and deeper into abysses from which they might never fully escape. The atmosphere in the Bennett mansion changed in a way that was hard to notice, but very important when the new year began. It wasn't something that could be seen or heard, but it was a change in the quality of the silence that filled those halls. The silence had a texture of its own, almost like it was solid, pushing against the walls and ceilings as if the air itself had gained weight. Margaret could feel this change in her bones. It was a constant pressure that made her joints hurt even when it was warm outside. Thomas spent most of January completely redoing how he kept track of things. He realized that the notes he had been taking over the past few months had become too messy, with too many contradictions and gaps that made them less useful. He chose to make a new, stricter, and more organized way of doing things. He split the information into groups that only made sense to his very organized mind. For weeks, he worked on this, moving old data to new notebooks, fixing mistakes and setting up patterns he hoped to keep going. Margaret watched the project with quiet doubt, not believing that they could bring order to what they had made in the depths of their home. During this time, the routine in the basement got even more intense, which meant that both of them had to do even more. Margaret realized that she had to go down 6 or 7 times a day instead of 4, and each time it took longer. Her legs started to hurt from going up and down those concrete stairs all the time, and she started to walk in a strange way, favoring her right side to ease the pressure on her left knee, which was starting to complain. Thomas saw, but didn't say anything. He was too busy with his own problems to offer sympathy, which wouldn't have helped anyway. The winter of that year was especially bad for Georgia. On the coldest mornings, frost covered the garden, and the mansion's heating system had a hard time keeping the upper rooms warm. The basement stayed at a steady temperature, which was funny because it was buried underground and had layers of insulation around it. Not because it was cold, but because the weight of the blankets gave her mental comfort, like a constant hug she couldn't get anywhere else. Thomas chose to cut back on how often he appeared in public by a lot. He gave most of his business duties to partners and middlemen, keeping only the most important ones under his control through letters and occasional meetings at his home office. This meant that he spent almost all of his time at the mansion now, and his constant presence changed the way things were between him and Margaret. They had to talk about how to fit in time and space in ways that weren't necessary when they missed more days. These talks didn't happen with words very often. Instead, they happened with looks and carefully planned movements that kept them from getting into fights, both physical and emotional. Margaret started to wonder if everything they had built would last. She didn't say anything to Thomas, but she did talk to herself in her head during the early morning hours when she was alone. She thought about how long they could keep going like this and what signs would show that they had hit a wall and couldn't go any further. These thoughts didn't make her do anything. They just flew around in her head like birds stuck in a cage, banging against the bars but not getting out. Her imagination was as trapped as the rest of her life, and she couldn't think of any other options. Margaret's shopping trips got more and more complicated. She started going to different cities every week, never going to the same place twice in a row. She acted like different people in each place, using different accents and cover stories to explain her strange needs. She was a widow taking care of a sick family member in one place. In another, she was a nurse who worked from home. In a third, she was just an odd woman whose oddities were enough to explain her behavior. She found out that she was good at these little shows, which gave her a creative outlet that she didn't have in the rest of her life. Thomas became obsessed with making the basement's structure safer. He hired an engineer from another state and paid a lot for a consultation that included checking the foundations without asking about how the space would be used. The engineer wrote a long report on how things could be better, and Thomas carefully followed each suggestion. He put in support beams, added more layers of material to the walls to make them stronger, and put in an even more advanced drainage system. The work took weeks and a lot of money, but Thomas thought every penny was well spent. Margaret looked at these changes with almost clinical detachment, as if they were changes to a house that wasn't hers. During this time, Margaret's dreams changed, becoming more detailed and scary. She now dreamed of mirrors that showed her image over and over again, each time a little different from the last. It was as if she were seeing all the different versions of herself that she could have been if she had made different choices at important times. In these dreams, she tried to talk to the other Margarets, but none of them could hear her because they were all stuck behind glass that couldn't be broken. She would wake up from these dreams feeling so sad that it took her hours to be able to face the day. The relationship between Thomas and Margaret had reached a strange, almost symbiotic balance. They worked together as one organism with two parts, each doing a job that helped the whole thing work. Thomas was the brain behind the plans and the systems, while Margaret was the hands that carried them out with the precision that comes from doing them over and over again. This way of dividing up work was effective, but it made them less human by turning them into parts of a machine instead of people with their own wants and needs. They didn't touch each other much anymore. Their bodies were in the same space, but they kept a safe distance between them, as if touching could break the fragile structure that kept them working. One day, Margaret found a thin crack in the basement wall that went from the ceiling to about shoulder height. She was more worried about the discovery than she should have been, so she called Thomas right away to look at it. He looked closely at the crack and ran his fingers over it as if he were reading Braille. He decided that it was just a surface issue caused by the structure settling and that it didn't pose a threat to the integrity of the space. But Margaret couldn't stop looking at that thin line. To her, it was a metaphor for the cracks that were starting to show up inside of them, not in the walls, but in themselves. No amount of concrete or bricks could seal them up. During his office hours, Thomas started talking to himself. They weren't full conversations. They were just bits of spoken thoughts, words that came out without meaning to. Margaret listened through the closed door. She couldn't make out full sentences, but she could tell that someone was trying to convince themselves of something. She never talked about hearing these involuntary monologues because they both wanted to keep up the appearance of privacy, even though they were always close to each other. Each had secrets inside that they didn't even tell the other, and they kept their thoughts and feelings just as safe as the things they kept in the basement. There were finally signs that spring was on the way after winter. Green shoots slowly started to grow in the neglected garden, showing that life will always come back, even when there is no care or encouragement. Margaret watched them through the kitchen window and felt a little jealous. She wished she could be as strong as these plants that come back to life every year, no matter what happens to them. She felt worn out to the point where she couldn't renew herself, as if all of her vital energy had been slowly drained over the months until only a shell remained, working through habit and inertia. While going through his old records, Thomas found something that upset him. He saw patterns he hadn't seen before, cycles that happened at certain times, which suggested that there was some logic behind them that he hadn't noticed before. This news made him both excited and upset, which made him think that maybe there was order where he had thought there was only chaos. He spent days working on this analysis, making graphs and tables to try to show these new patterns. Margaret became more and more worried as she watched this intellectual frenzy. She was afraid that he was getting lost in ideas that would make him even more distant from the already distorted reality they lived in. Spring came on with a bang, bringing heavy rains that turned Savannah's streets into small rivers and put the city's drainage systems to the test. The Bennett mansion stood up to the storms because it was built so well, but moisture got in through the cracks and poorly sealed windows, leaving dark stains on the walls and a musty smell that Margaret tried to get rid of but couldn't. The basement, on the other hand, stayed dry because of the complicated systems Thomas had put in place to protect it from the elements, while the rest of the house suffered. Margaret started to have more and more trouble sleeping. It wasn't normal insomnia. She couldn't get any real rest even when she closed her eyes for hours. She would wake up as tired as when she went to bed, as if she had been doing hard work on a plane that she couldn't remember. During the day, her eyelids felt heavy, but at night, her eyes stayed wide open, staring at the dark ceiling where shadows danced as cars passed by on the street, their headlights casting fleeting patterns through the curtains. Thomas noticed that his own thoughts were changing in a way that made him uneasy. He found it harder and harder to keep his thoughts straight, and his mind would jump from one idea to another without finishing his reasoning. He never finished the sentences he started. He stopped doing the math he had started halfway through, and when he looked at pages of his diary, he didn't recognize his own handwriting. He was more scared of this cognitive fragmentation than he wanted to admit, which showed that he was getting worse than just being tired or stressed. The couple started to avoid each other on purpose. They made unspoken plans so they wouldn't run into each other too often, with each person staying in a different room at certain times. When their paths crossed, they said a few polite words to each other and then quickly moved on, like polite strangers sharing a crowded train. This growing emotional distance was both a relief and a torment. It gave them a break from how close they were, but it also made them feel even more alone. Margaret got into the habit of talking to things in the house that weren't alive. While she cooked, she would talk to the pots and pans, comment on the weather to the furniture in the living room, and tell books she had never finished reading what she was thinking. These one-sided talks filled the mansion with noise and made her feel like she had someone to talk to, which she didn't get from Thomas anymore. He sometimes heard these talks through the walls and felt a mix of worry and jealousy. He wished he could easily say what was on his mind like they could. The storms in the spring caused a number of power outages that left the mansion in the dark for hours. Margaret liked these breaks better because the complete darkness let her imagination fill the space without being contradicted by what she could see. She would sit in the room with candles that weren't lit, just taking in the lack of light and sound. She was in a temporary vacuum where the past and future lost their meaning. Thomas did the opposite. He lit every lantern and candle he could find because he couldn't stand the darkness that seemed to make the echoes of his own choices louder. During this humid time, the basement needed constant changes. Thomas went down several times a day to check the humidity levels and make sure the systems that control the environment were working right. He learned everything there was to know about every pipe, valve, and electrical connection in that underground area. Margaret saw this growing obsession with detachment that was almost like dissociation, as if she were watching someone else's life through thick glass that made sounds and images look strange. Thomas started to wonder about the linearity of time in ways he had never done before. He saw that days were blending together without clear signs of when they ended, and he often didn't know how long it had been since certain things happened. He couldn't say what made a week feel like a day or a month. This changing of time made him feel lost and added to his sense of being disconnected from reality. He felt like he was floating in his own dimension, where rules only applied to his property. Margaret found out that she had completely forgotten some things about her life before the basement. She tried to remember her friends, the things she liked to do, and the dreams she had. But these memories had become hazy and inaccessible, as if they belonged to a completely different person. She was now only the version of herself that existed in relation to that basement, her identity completely consumed and redefined by it. This loss of personal continuity should have disturbed her more than it did, but she found that she felt only a vague sense of sadness, as when hearing about a tragedy that had befallen someone she had never met. The meals they shared turned into exercises in complete silence. They sat at opposite ends of the dining table, chewing food they didn't taste, and carefully avoiding any eye contact that could have led to recognition or communication. The only sounds were the clinking of cutlery against porcelain and the occasional gulp of water. This empty ritual repeated itself day after day, more habit than necessity, maintained only because abandoning it would require conscious decision and energy that neither of them possessed. Thomas began experiencing episodes of tremors that started in his hands and spread to his arms. They came on without warning, particularly when he tried to perform tasks requiring precision. He attributed it to fatigue, or perhaps nutritional deficiency, refusing to consider deeper, more worrying causes. Margaret noticed but didn't comment, recognizing in his tremors a reflection of her own physical deterioration. Both were falling apart, each in their own way, but to acknowledge this openly would be to admit a defeat they were not yet prepared to accept. Spring advanced, indifferent to the dramas contained within that mansion. Flowers bloomed in the abandoned garden. Birds built nests on the eaves, and the outside world pulsed with life and renewal. But within the Bennett walls there was only stagnation and gradual decline, as if the property existed in a separate temporal bubble, where the seasons changed but nothing truly progressed. They had created their own closed universe, governed by laws that violated both the physics and metaphysics of the normal world. And now they were trapped in it, without a map or compass to show them the way back to the reality they had abandoned. Summer returned with its relentless heat, transforming the Bennett mansion into a claustrophobic space where the air seemed to solidify into oppressive layers. Margaret began to move in slow motion during the hottest afternoons, each gesture requiring conscious effort that depleted her already dwindling energy reserves. She developed the habit of sitting at the bottom of the stairs leading to the basement, where the air was a few degrees cooler, closing her eyes and trying not to think about anything for precious minutes of mental emptiness. Thomas made a choice that even he was surprised by. He began writing something that wasn't technical records or practical notes, but reflections bordering on the philosophical about the nature of human choices and the paths that lead ordinary people to extraordinary places. These pages were unlike anything he had written before, more honest and vulnerable, revealing doubts he had kept hidden even from Margaret. He hid these writings in a secret compartment in his desk, as if they were confessions that no one should read, not even himself when he revisited them. The house's structure began to show signs of wear and tear that went beyond the mere passage of time. Cracks appeared in walls that had once been solid, doors jammed in frames that seemed to have changed shape, and the wooden floor of the second floor began to creak with complaints that echoed through the empty hallways. Margaret interpreted these manifestations as if the house itself were protesting against what it housed, slowly rejecting the weight of the secrets it was forced to carry. Thomas saw only structural problems that needed maintenance, but even he couldn't completely ignore the peculiar timing of these deteriorations. Margaret had a moment of sudden clarity. One August morning, she was making coffee when she suddenly realized, with absolute certainty, that she had crossed some invisible threshold beyond which return was impossible. It wasn't a revelation accompanied by panic or despair, but simple factual acceptance, like realizing it's raining or that the sun has risen. She poured the coffee with trembling hands, watched the dark liquid spread across the table surface, and felt something close to peace. The terrible peace of someone who has finally stopped fighting the current and surrendered to the river that carries her to an unknown destination. Thomas started to see things out of the corner of his eye that weren't really there. For example, shadows that moved through the corners of his vision and shapes that vanished when he turned his head to look at them. He thought it was because he was tired, or maybe because his eyes were starting to have problems that he would need to get checked out. But deep down, in a part of his mind that he wouldn't let himself think about, he thought these ghosts were signs of something deeper guilt or fear taking shape on the edges of his perception. The couple made their own language out of small gestures and looks that meant a lot. A nod took the place of long explanations. A furrowed brow showed that there were many worries. A sigh said a lot about giving up and being tired. They had gone beyond the need for words, or maybe they had lost the ability to use them well. They were now communicating in a very basic way that was both effective and very lonely. Each was in a bubble of silence that the other could only break through on the surface. Margaret started to lose time in ways she couldn't explain. She would start a job and then, without remembering what she had done during that time, hours would go by. At first, these time gaps scared her, but she learned to accept them as part of the new normal. They were just another way her mind was adapting, or maybe giving up under constant stress. When Thomas came back to the present, she noticed these absences in small ways, like how her eyes looked confused for a moment before she got her bearings again. In both of their minds, the basement had become almost alive. They talked about it as if it were a being with its own will, something that made demands and needed to be satisfied. Margaret thought of it as a conscious being that watched and judged, while Thomas thought of it as a living thing that needed to be fed and cared for in order to keep working. This personification of the space was a way for them to avoid taking responsibility by giving the place power instead of themselves. It made them feel like there was a distance between who they were and what they did. Thomas had a dream that kept coming back to him. In it, he was trying to climb staircases that kept getting bigger and bigger. Each step took him deeper, until he was buried in depths that were impossible to escape. He would wake up from these dreams feeling like he couldn't breathe because the air was too thin. Margaret had her own nightmares that were just as scary but different in detail. Each one used dream symbols to deal with fears that they couldn't face directly while awake. It was hard for anyone outside the Bennett family to explain the strange flow of money in and out of their bank account. Large amounts of money were regularly sent to different suppliers in faraway cities. These purchases didn't fit with the couple's apparent lifestyle as recluses. Thomas took great care of these finances, making sure that nothing raised any eyebrows with banks or the IRS. He had set up a complicated web of transactions that hid the true nature of his spending and added layers of legitimacy to protect the secret core of his business. Margaret found out that she could completely turn off her feelings when she needed to. She could do things in the basement with cold, clinical efficiency, and her mind was completely separate from how her hands felt about what they were doing. It was a kind of dissociation that had become a necessary part of staying mentally healthy. When she went back to the upper rooms, the feelings came back in waves that made her tired and shaky. Thomas watched these episodes after the basement with helpless worry. He couldn't give the comfort he needed but didn't get. July was the hottest month of summer, with temperatures so high that smart people would stay inside with the windows closed and fans running uselessly. The Bennett mansion turned into an oven during these heat waves, and even the basement, which is usually cool, started to heat up in ways that needed constant attention. Thomas stayed up all night, checking temperatures and making changes to the systems. He wouldn't sleep until he was sure everything was working right. This constant watchfulness took a visible toll on him. His eyes sank deeper into darker sockets, and his skin became sickly pale. During one of those suffocating nights, Margaret had an epiphany. She knew that she hadn't dreamed about the future in a long time, and that her mind couldn't picture anything beyond the next day or week. The future had turned into an abstract idea that didn't mean anything to him, and belonged to other people in other lives. She only lived in the present, with no larger story to give meaning to the sequence of events. Each moment was connected to the one before and after it only through mechanical continuity. This lack of time was very freeing. It took away my worries about what was to come and my hopes that things could be different. The Bennett mansion's dirty windows let in light that changed slowly over time, marking the arrival of fall almost without anyone noticing. Margaret first noticed when she saw that the shadows were falling at different angles, getting longer earlier in the afternoon, and making patterns on the walls that she hadn't seen in months. The change of season made her even sadder than usual. It felt like the emotional weight was getting heavier in the already heavy air of the house. She sat in an armchair in the library for hours, looking out the window at the trees that were starting to lose their leaves. Each leaf that fell was like a small defeat, a quiet surrender to time and gravity. Thomas became obsessed with mapping out every square inch of the basement. He spent weeks measuring and patching, making detailed diagrams that showed not only the size of the rooms, but also the flow of air, the levels of humidity, the changes in temperature, and a dozen other factors that only he thought were important. This project took up all of his mornings and afternoons, leaving him tired but strangely happy, as if writing down everything in great detail gave him some kind of control over what he couldn't control. Margaret saw these plans and diagrams all over her office and thought they were a desperate attempt to bring order to the chaos that had taken over their lives. It became more and more clear and concerning that Margaret's health was getting worse. She started to cough for minutes at a time, which made her bend over and gasp for breath. She had to hold on to furniture to keep from falling. No amount of sun could fix her grayish skin, and the dark circles under her eyes got darker until they looked like holes in her face. Thomas told her to see a doctor, but she strongly disagreed, saying that no doctor could figure out what was really wrong with her or fix it. He didn't push, knowing that she was right. Her symptoms were signs of a disease that wasn't in medical books. The couple started talking to each other in bits and pieces that never got anywhere. Thomas would start a sentence about how things needed to change, but then he would stop talking, as if he had forgotten what he was going to say halfway through. Margaret would answer questions that weren't even asked, giving answers to questions that were only in their own heads. These disconnected conversations became their main way of talking to each other. They were conversations that only made sense to them, if they made sense to anyone at all. Someone watching from the outside would think they were watching two people talk to each other in different languages, with each person hearing only distorted echoes of what the other person said. Margaret got into the habit of writing letters that she never sent. She sent them to people she used to know, like friends and family she hadn't seen in years, and even earlier versions of herself. In these letters, she tried to explain how she got to where she was and how a series of seemingly small choices had led her to a place where she felt completely trapped. But before she was done, she always ripped the pages into tiny pieces and threw them away, as if the words themselves were proof of crimes that needed to be destroyed. Thomas sometimes found these pieces and tried to put them together into full sentences, but he always gave up because he knew that some confessions would never be complete. The basement started making noises that didn't match up with any of the equipment or systems that were already there. They were quiet sounds that could easily be blamed on old pipes or settling structures, but when they all came together, they made a disturbing symphony of metallic groans, dry crackles, and sighs that sounded almost alive. Thomas looked into every sound obsessively, going down with tools and flashlights to find out where they were coming from, but he rarely found good reasons. Margaret gave up trying to explain these things and accepted them as signs of something more than just the physical. The house was showing how uncomfortable it was with what it had to hold. Thomas started to doubt his own memories of how it all began. He tried to remember the exact time when he made the first important choice, the point at which the normal path split into two paths, one normal and one extraordinary. But every time they tried to get it back, this origin became less clear. It was as if his brain were deliberately obscuring certain events, protecting him from directly confronting the choices that had brought him there. He wondered if Margaret had the same memory problems, but he never had the guts to ask her because he was afraid that an honest talk about their pasts would completely break down the weak reasons they both had for being together. One afternoon in October, Margaret had a strange experience. She was in the basement, doing her normal things, when all of a sudden she felt like she was watching herself from outside her body, floating near the ceiling and seeing her movements from a different angle. The feeling only lasted a few seconds before she suddenly came back to herself, but it made her shake and feel lost. She stumbled up the stairs and locked herself in her room. When Thomas knocked on the door and asked her to come out, she didn't answer. She spent hours in bed, curled up, trying to make sense of what had happened and what it meant for her mental health. While going over old financial records, Thomas found something that really upset him. He realized that he had spent a lot more money than he thought he had, and that his net worth had gone down a lot over the months without him even noticing. The numbers on the pages told a story of obsession that had taken up a lot of time, energy, and money. He did some quick math and saw that if he kept going at this rate, his reserves would be dangerously low in a year or two. This made him face a question he had been putting off. What they had made was not financially sustainable in the long run, on top of all the other problems. Margaret started to notice patterns in things that didn't seem to have any. There were cracks in the walls that looked like people she knew. Wet spots made maps of places she'd never been. Shadows formed shapes that looked like they had meanings that she couldn't understand. She knew that these thoughts were probably hallucinations or projections of her mind when she was under a lot of stress, but she couldn't stop looking for them or trying to figure out messages that might not have been there. Thomas saw her a few times standing still, staring at a wall or ceiling, and tracing shapes in the air with her trembling fingers. He didn't ask what she saw because he was afraid of both the answer and the chance that he would start to see the same things. Every Sunday night at midnight, the couple would meet in the basement for a strange ritual. They didn't talk about why they were meeting or what they did during them, but both showed up on time, as if they were responding to a call that neither of them had spoken. These nightly meetings felt almost like a ceremony, and the way they were done was very serious, almost religious. It was as if they were trying to please something by doing the same thing over and over again, giving presence and attention as a sacrifice that kept things in a fragile balance. After these meetings, both of them would go upstairs to their own beds, tired. Margaret would go to the master bedroom and Thomas would go to the study, where they would stay apart until the next morning. Thomas started to have a tic where he kept checking locks. He would pull on doorknobs and check keys with a sense of urgency that made him do it 3, 4, or 5 times before he could leave. Margaret watched these obsessive checks with a mix of understanding and annoyance. She saw them as a reflection of her own worries, but she was tired of seeing the physical expression of fears she shared. She had her own compulsions, like putting things in certain patterns and making sure they stayed that way, or else she thought something bad would happen, even though she couldn't say what it would be. During a particularly bad case of insomnia, Margaret had a disturbing thought. She realized that she had completely stopped thinking about who she might be if she weren't stuck in that situation. It was impossible to separate her identity from the role she played in the mansion because they had become so intertwined. She was no longer just a person who kept a secret. She was the secret itself, and her life was completely defined by what she kept hidden. She should have been horrified by this news, but she felt nothing. She accepted that a change had happened so slowly that she hadn't noticed it until it was too late and couldn't be changed back. Thomas started writing down step-by-step instructions for how to take care of all the systems in the basement, as if he were making a manual for someone else to use when he was no longer able to do it. He never told Margaret about this project, and she never asked, but they both knew that he was leaving behind a darker kind of legacy, records of processes that would normally die with their creators. These instructions were so detailed that they were almost obsessive. They included diagrams, schedules, lists of suppliers, and emergency plans for things he hoped would never happen, but that his methodically prepared mind couldn't help but think about. As autumn went on, the weeks started to look the same. In the garden, leaves piled up in thicker and thicker layers, slowly rotting into a carpet of organic matter that no one touched. It looked like nature was slowly taking back the mansion, making it look even more abandoned. The dust and pollen on the windows made it hard to see outside, which made it even harder for the Bennetts to connect with the outside world they had almost completely given up on. They were now almost completely alone, like an island with only two people on it. They were stuck in a situation they had made together, but neither of them could fully control or understand it anymore, adrift at sea with no visible horizon. Winter came back like a closing circle, bringing with it bone-chilling cold and morning fog that covered the Bennett mansion in a white shroud. On the coldest mornings, Margaret felt like she was coming up from the bottom of the ocean. Every breath took effort. She walked through the house like a ghost of herself, leaving only the cold air that curved around her path. Thomas hardly ever slept anymore. Instead, he spent his nights in his office, where papers and maps covered every surface, silent witnesses to an obsession that never went away. The basement was still the center of everything, a place where their lives revolved around it, but their relationship with that space had changed in some small way. It was no longer just a place that needed to be paid attention to and cared for. It was a presence that watched them back and waited for something they couldn't name. Margaret felt this most when she was alone, as if she were being judged by standards she didn't understand. Thomas said that these feelings were caused by being tired and stressed, but even he couldn't completely deny how heavy the air felt as it got thicker every day. The routines they had kept up for so long started to fall apart. Plans that had been set in stone became flexible and then were completely ignored. People skipped meals or ate them at random times. Daily check-ins became less frequent. It was as if both were losing their ability or desire to keep up with structures that had once seemed necessary. Margaret would spend whole days in her room without leaving, and Thomas would sometimes go down to the basement for longer than he needed to. They were slowly breaking down, losing the lines that made them separate and useful people. On a gray December afternoon, Margaret had a moment of clarity. She was at the window of the living room watching the rain wash over the streets when she realized she didn't feel scared, guilty, or any other strong emotion anymore. There was only calm emptiness, a full acceptance that she had changed from who she used to be and crossed lines that had changed her forever. This realization didn't exactly bring her peace, but it did end the internal conflict that had been bothering her. It was the end of the line, the end of the last hopes for normalcy or redemption. She shut her eyes and let the rain wash away all her thoughts, leaving only a small part of herself in the present moment. Thomas found the letters and unfinished confessions that Margaret had been collecting over the months. He read them on a night when he couldn't sleep, and each word broke down the walls she had built up to protect herself. He could see through those ripped pages what they had done to the human soul, not in general terms, but in terms of how it had gotten worse. He cried for the first time in a long time. Silent tears ran down his face as he burned each piece of paper in the fireplace of his office. The fire burned up Margaret's words, turning her confessions into ashes that he spread across the garden the next morning, giving them back to the earth, which may have been kinder than he had been. The last few days of the year went by in a blur of apathy. Margaret and Thomas were close to each other physically, but emotionally they were worlds apart, each going through a separate experience of breaking down. The basement continued to demand attention, but they now responded with mechanical efficiency, devoid of any emotional investment. It was work performed by bodies on autopilot, while minds wandered through increasingly strange and uninhabitable inner territories. The mansion itself seemed to sigh under the weight of all it contained, a weary structure yearning for rest that would not come anytime soon. The story of the Bennett family is a reminder of what happens when normal people make unusual choices and secrets become more real than lives lived in the open. The basement of that Savannah mansion still has secrets. It's a place that exists between reality and something darker, and it shows how easily we can lose ourselves when we stop questioning the paths we choose to take. Every house has stories in its foundations, but some stories are too heavy for even brick walls and wooden beams to hold up without eventually cracking under the weight.